The massive Senate chamber of the Galactic Council buzzed with activity. Hundreds of alien species filled the circular room, their voices a mix of clicks, whistles, and words in countless languages. High above them, floating in a beam of blue light, was an object that had puzzled the greatest minds in the galaxy for over 300 years. The Eternal Cube, as they called it, was both simple and impossible. It was about the size of a melon, with surfaces that seemed to shift between black and silver depending on how you looked at it. Strange marks covered its sides, and sometimes, if you watched it long enough, parts of it appeared to move on their own. "Another failed attempt," announced High Speaker Reed, his 4 eyes blinking slowly as he addressed the Senate. The tall, blue-skinned alien's voice carried a weight of disappointment that everyone in the chamber felt. "The combined computing power of the 3 star systems has failed to decode the cube's patterns." In their special section, the Council of Science Masters lowered their heads. They had spent 50 years on this latest attempt. The cost had been enormous, using enough energy to power a small planet for a year. And still, the cube remained a mystery. "Perhaps," said Master Builder Dex, his crystalline body catching the light, "we should accept that some mysteries of the ancients are beyond even our understanding." His words made many in the chamber nod in agreement. After all, if the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy couldn't solve it, maybe no one could. But not everyone was ready to give up. From her seat in the observation ring, Professor Lin watched the cube with narrow eyes. She had studied it for 20 years, and something about it still bothered her. The way it seemed to react to different things, light, sound, and sometimes even the mood of the room, suggested it was more than just a puzzle. It felt almost playful. The Senate continued their debate, their voices echoing off the chamber's ancient walls. They talked about the cube's history, how it had been found in the ruins of a civilization so old that even their name had been lost to time. They discussed the millions of attempts to unlock its secrets, the countless theories about what might be hidden inside. "The humans have requested to join today's session," announced an aide, causing a ripple of surprise through the chamber. Earth had only joined the galactic community 2 years ago. They were still considered newcomers, barely able to travel beyond their own solar system. High Speaker Reed nodded politely, though several members of the Senate didn't bother hiding their dismissal. What could humans possibly add to a discussion that had stumped the galaxy's brightest minds for centuries? The human ambassador walked in, wearing their simple blue uniform that looked plain compared to the elaborate robes of other species. "We appreciate being included in this historic discussion," the ambassador said, bowing slightly. "Earth has always valued the pursuit of knowledge." As the ambassador took their seat, Professor Lin noticed something interesting. Unlike the other species, who looked at the cube with reverence or frustration, the human's eyes held something different: wonder. It was the same look she had seen in young aliens when they first visited the Senate, before they learned enough to be properly impressed by the cube's impossibility. "The next attempt to decode the cube will begin in 3 standard months," High Speaker Reed announced. "The Science Council will use new quantum mapping techniques that—" He was interrupted by a soft chime. The cube had started humming, something it did occasionally. But this time was different. As the human ambassador looked up at it, the cube's surface rippled like water, and for just a moment, one of its corners glowed with a warm golden light. The chamber fell silent. In 300 years, no one had ever seen it do that before. Professor Lin leaned forward in her seat, her antennae twitching with excitement. Maybe, she thought, looking between the human and the cube, it was time to try something new, something different, something human. The day of the annual Galaxy Youth Day arrived with more excitement than usual. Hundreds of young aliens filled the Senate's great halls, their excited chatter mixing with the hum of translation devices. It was a tradition meant to inspire the next generation of galactic leaders, though everyone knew to keep the young ones away from the sensitive areas, especially the chamber holding the Eternal Cube. Ambassador Jack Miller hadn't planned to bring his son Tom to work today, But his wife had an emergency at the Earth Embassy, and 8-year-old Tom's school was closed for maintenance on their artificial gravity systems. So here he was, trying to keep his energetic son from touching everything in sight. "Dad, why is that alien green?" "Oh, that one has 3 heads. Can I say hi?" Tom's questions came rapid fire as they walked through the halls. "Tom, remember what we talked about?" Jack said quietly, guiding his son past a group of dignified-looking aliens. "This is a very important place. You need to be on my best behavior." Tom finished, trying to stand straighter. He managed to stay serious for about 5 seconds before getting distracted by a floating light display. Professor Lin watched the human child with growing interest. She had been studying human behavior since their arrival in the galactic community, and children were particularly fascinating. Unlike young aliens who were taught to control themselves from an early age, human children seemed to bounce between curiosity and chaos with no middle ground. "The Youth Day Tour will begin in the historical wing," announced the guide, a tall alien with silvery scales. As the group moved forward, Professor Lin noticed Tom falling behind, his attention caught by something in the opposite direction. The boy had spotted the soft glow coming from the cube chamber. Despite the signs marking it as restricted, he wandered closer, drawn by the strange light. His father was busy talking to another ambassador and hadn't noticed his son's departure. "It's pretty," Tom said as he pressed his face against the clear barrier separating the cube from visitors. Professor Lin, who had followed him, was about to remind him about the restricted area when she noticed something extraordinary. The cube was responding to his presence. The surface of the ancient artifact rippled with waves of golden light, much like it had during the previous session. But this time, the response was stronger. The patterns on its surface began to shift and change, creating swirls of color that seemed to follow Tom's movements. "It looks like it wants to play," Tom said simply, touching the barrier with one hand. The cube pulsed brighter in response. By now, others had noticed. A small crowd gathered, watching in amazement as the supposedly dormant artifact put on a light show for a human child. High Speaker Reed himself hurried over, all 4 eyes wide with disbelief. "Young human," Reed said carefully, trying to hide his excitement, "what do you see when you look at the cube?" Tom shrugged, still watching the dancing lights. "It's like my puzzle box from Uncle Ben, but bigger. See how it moves when you move? That's what my box does too." The gathered aliens exchanged confused looks. How could this child compare their greatest archaeological mystery to a simple toy? But Professor Lin stepped forward, her antennae twitching with sudden understanding. "High Speaker," she said, "perhaps we should let the boy explain more about this puzzle box." Jack finally noticed where his son had wandered and rushed over, ready to apologize. But before he could speak, the cube did something it had never done before in all its centuries of study. It began to sing. The sound was soft and melodic, like a lullaby in a language no one had heard before, and as it sang, one of its corners slowly began to open. The singing cube had caused quite a stir in the Senate chamber. Aliens of every species crowded around, their usual formal behavior forgotten in the excitement. Security guards tried to maintain order, but everyone wanted to see what was happening. Tom, still standing by the barrier, watched the cube with the kind of focus only children can manage when something really interests them. He didn't care about the important aliens gathering around or his father's nervous looks. He just wanted to understand why the cube seemed so familiar. "It's cold," he said suddenly, making Professor Lin's antennae twitch with interest. "Cold?" she asked, kneeling down beside him. "What do you mean?" Tom pointed at the barrier. "The cube. It's shivering. Like when you take ice cream out of the freezer and it gets all frosty on top. That's why it's singing. It's cold." The gathered aliens looked at each other in confusion. Temperature had never been considered a factor in their studies. The cube was kept at a perfect, stable temperature, as all ancient artifacts were. High Speaker Reed stepped forward, his long robes sweeping the floor. "Young human, The cube is maintained at precisely 15 degrees Celsius, the standard preservation temperature for all artifacts. But that's too cold, Tom protested. If it's like my puzzle box, it needs to be warm to work. Uncle Ben said the special metal inside changes when it gets warm. That's how the pieces can move. Ambassador Jack put a hand on his son's shoulder, ready to apologize for his outburst. But Professor Lin held up a hand to stop him. Let him continue, she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. Tom looked at the cube again, his face crunched up in thought. When I got my puzzle box, it was all stuck too. But Uncle Ben told me to hold it in my hands for a while. The warm makes the pieces loose so they can slide. See? He pointed at the cube's surface. Those lines are where it's supposed to move, but it's too cold to work. The Science Council members who had joined the crowd began muttering among themselves. One of them, a being made of pure energy contained in a special suit, floated forward. Impossible, the scientist said. We've studied every property of the cube, its molecular structure, its quantum state, its temporal alignment. There's no indication it responds to simple thermal changes. But Professor Lin was already checking something on her datapad. Actually, she said, her voice growing excited, there is. Look at these readings from earlier when the cube reacted to Tom. The energy patterns, they changed slightly when he touched the barrier. The barrier that's been warming up from all of us standing near it. The cube's song changed pitch, becoming slightly higher. More of its corner had opened, revealing what looked like sliding panels beneath its outer shell. It's like a big puzzle box, Tom said again, bouncing on his toes. But it works backwards from mine. Mine gets harder when it's cold, but this one. He trailed off, thinking hard. This one wants to be cold first, then warm. Like when you put a popsicle in warm water to get it out of the stick. The aliens stared at the child in amazement. Centuries of advanced scientific study. And none of them had thought to consider something so basic as temperature change. They had treated the cube as a sacred relic, keeping it carefully preserved at a constant temperature, never imagining it might need to experience change to function. High speaker, Professor Lin said, standing up straight. I believe we should listen to the boy. Perhaps it's time we tried something simple. The cube's song grew louder, as if agreeing, and as they watched, more lines appeared on its surface, forming patterns that looked surprisingly like instructions. Instructions that only became visible when the metal began to warm. The entire Senate chamber held its breath as the security barrier around the eternal cube slowly lowered. 300 years of strict preservation protocols were being broken, all because of an 8-year-old boy's observation. Remember, Professor Lin said to the gathered crowd, we must proceed carefully. If the boy is right about the temperature activation, we still need to. It wants to play. Tom interrupted, already reaching for the cube before anyone could stop him. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber as his small hands touched the ancient artifact. Ambassador Jack stepped forward to pull his son back, but Professor Lin caught his arm. Wait, she whispered. Look! The cube's surface had come alive under Tom's touch. The previously dull metal now rippled with waves of golden light, and the singing grew stronger. Where Tom's warm hands met the cold surface, intricate patterns began to appear, like frost melting to reveal hidden writing underneath. It's showing us the rules, Tom announced excitedly. See, just like my puzzle box, the pictures tell you how to move the pieces. High speaker Reed leaned in closer, his 4 eyes widening. Extraordinary. In all our studies, we never saw these markings. Our instruments never detected them. Because you never made it warm, Tom explained, turning the cube carefully in his hands. Uncle Ben says some metals remember their shape when they get warm. This one remembers lots of shapes. The Science Council members were frantically recording everything, their instruments tracking every change in the cube's structure. The energy-being scientist floated closer, its containment suit humming with excitement. The boy is correct, it announced. The cube's molecular structure is responding to the thermal energy from his hands. It's not just showing patterns, it's actually reconfiguring itself. Tom wasn't paying attention to the scientists. He was focused entirely on the cube, his fingers tracing the appearing patterns. "It's like a story," he said. "Each picture shows the next move, but you have to do them backwards from normal." Professor Lin watched in amazement as Tom began to slide sections of the cube in different directions. Each move was accompanied by a new musical note from the cube, creating a melody that grew more complex with each correct step. "Impossible," one of the council members shouted. "The mathematical probability of solving that sequence is—" The cube chimed loudly, cutting off the scientists' protest as another section clicked into place. "You're all thinking too hard," Tom said, not looking up from his work. "It's not math. It's not science. It's just a toy. A really cool toy that someone made for their kids a long time ago." The aliens watched in stunned silence as this human child, who knew nothing of quantum mechanics or temporal physics, continued to solve their greatest mystery as if it were nothing more than a simple puzzle. "Last piece," Tom announced. His tongue stuck out slightly as he concentrated on the final movement. "This part's tricky. You have to warm up both sides at the same time, or it gets stuck again." The cube's song reached a crescendo as Tom made the final move. There was a soft click, then a series of whirring sounds as mechanisms that hadn't moved in millennia finally activated. The entire chamber fell silent as the cube's top surface began to open like a flower blooming in the sun. Even Tom stood still, his eyes wide with wonder at what he had done. Inside the cube, something was glowing with a soft, warm light, and as the panels fully opened, a small hologram flickered to life above it, showing an image that would change the galaxy's understanding of the ancient civilization forever. News traveled faster than light across the galaxy. Within hours, every major civilization had heard the incredible story. Human child solves the eternal cube. The Senate's communication systems were overwhelmed with messages from thousands of worlds, all demanding to know more. In the grand archives of the Senate, Tom sat eating an ice cream that someone had fetched for him, completely unaware of the chaos he had caused. Professor Lin watched him with amusement while the rest of the room buzzed with activity. "The Stellar Academy demands an immediate analysis of the solution method," one aide reported to High Speaker Reed. "The crystal minds of Proxima want to interview the boy. The Science Council of the Seven Systems is requesting an emergency session." High Speaker Reed held up all four hands for silence. "What we must understand," he said carefully, "is that this changes everything we thought we knew about problem-solving in the galaxy." Professor Lin nodded in agreement. "For centuries, we approached this artifact with our most advanced technology, our greatest scientific minds, our most powerful computers, and we were defeated by our own complexity." On the main viewing screen, reports were coming in from across the galaxy. Some species were taking the news badly. The Logical Collective, famous for their pure rational thinking, had declared a day of meditation to process their shock. The Ancient Studies Guild had to suspend operations when half their senior members resigned in embarrassment. "But how?" demanded one of the Science Council members, their crystalline form flickering with agitation. "How could we miss something so simple?" Tom looked up from his ice cream. "Because you didn't play with it," he said, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "You can't solve a puzzle if you're scared to touch it." His words, translated and broadcast across the Senate's networks, caused another wave of chaos. The idea that play could be more effective than serious study challenged everything the galactic community believed about knowledge and learning. Ambassador Jack stood proudly behind his son, though he still seemed a bit dazed by the whole situation. "On Earth," he explained to the gathered aliens, "we have a saying. Sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. Sometimes looking too closely at something makes you miss the bigger picture." The holographic projectors showed more reactions pouring in. Some species were already changing their research methods, introducing elements of play and simple exploration into their studies. Others were requesting human children as consultants for their most difficult scientific projects. something that made Ambassador Jack choke on his coffee. "What I find most interesting," Professor Lin said, her antennae twitching thoughtfully, "is that the cube wasn't meant to be a test of advanced intelligence at all. We made it into one because of our own assumptions." Tom nodded, finishing his ice cream. "It's like when my big sister helps me with homework. Sometimes she makes easy stuff really hard because she knows too much." The Senate chambers erupted in surprised laughter. Even High Speaker Reed's serious expression cracked into what might have been a smile. "From the minds of children," he announced formally, his voice carrying to all corners of the galaxy through the broadcast system, "we have learned a lesson in humility. Perhaps it is time for the galaxy to remember how to see things with simpler eyes." As if agreeing with his words, the solved cube sitting on display began to sing again, its soft melody carrying a hint of what seemed like laughter. The ancient civilization that created it had known something that the modern galaxy had forgotten. Sometimes the deepest wisdom comes wrapped in the simplest packages. And somewhere in the Senate building, a group of young aliens had already started a petition to make Tom teach them how to play with puzzles. As the excitement in the Senate chamber settled, everyone's attention turned back to the hologram floating above the opened cube. The image showed a group of alien children playing with similar cubes, their forms strange but their laughter unmistakable even across the ages. "It's a recording," Professor Lin explained, her voice filled with wonder. "A message left behind by the ancient civilization, but it's not what anyone expected." The hologram shifted, showing more scenes of children learning and playing. Different puzzles and toys appeared, each one designed to teach something important. The cube had been just one part of a whole collection of educational toys. Tom watched the hologram with deep interest. "They're just like my school," he said. "Look, they're learning by playing games." The alien text floating beside the images began to translate itself, another feature no one had discovered in all their years of study. The cube hadn't just been waiting for the right solution, it had been waiting for the right kind of solver. "To those who find joy in play," the translation read, "we send greetings across time. You have proven yourselves worthy not by your technology or your wisdom, but by keeping alive the spark of childhood wonder." High Speaker Reed read the words aloud, his voice carrying through the silent chamber. The message continued to unfold, revealing not the advanced weapons or cosmic secrets everyone had expected, but something far more valuable. "Our civilization reached the stars," the message continued, "but we never forgot the importance of play. In these cubes, we stored our greatest discovery, the understanding that learning should bring joy. A species that forgets how to play is a species that forgets how to grow." The Science Council members watched in stunned silence as their greatest mystery turned out to be a lesson in the importance of fun. The cube wasn't a test of intelligence, it was a reminder not to lose the simple wisdom of childhood. More holograms appeared, showing the ancient aliens teaching their young ones through games and puzzles. Each toy was designed to teach something different. Mathematics through music, physics through play, astronomy through dance. "They're teachers," Tom said suddenly, making everyone look at him. "Like Ms. Parker at my school. She makes learning fun too." Professor Lin's antennae twitched with excitement as she studied the data streaming from the cube. "The boy is right again. This isn't just a message, it's a gift." The cube contains designs for hundreds of educational toys and games. They left their teaching methods for others to find. Ambassador Jack put a hand on his son's shoulder, beaming with pride. "And it took a child to help us understand it." The hologram showed one final scene, a group of ancient alien children solving puzzles together, regardless of their different species or backgrounds. The message was clear: play was a universal language that could bridge any gap. "In every child's hands lies the future," the final translation read. "Never let your search for knowledge make you forget the wisdom of wonder." This is our legacy to the galaxy, not our technology, but our way of teaching. May it serve you well. As the hologram faded, the cube began to sing again. But this time, it wasn't just a single melody. It was teaching a song, waiting for someone to sing along. And in the great Senate chamber, surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy, Tom started to hum the tune. One by one, other voices joined in. First, the young aliens who had gathered to watch, then their parents, and finally even some of the dignified Senate members themselves. The ancient civilization's greatest gift wasn't the puzzle or the technology that created it. It was the reminder that sometimes the most important lessons come through play. 1 month after Tom solved the Eternal Cube, the galaxy was a very different place. The Senate chamber, once a place of strict formality, now had a new addition. A children's corner filled with puzzles and educational toys based on the ancient designs. The Young Minds Initiative has been approved by all member species, High Speaker Reed announced to the gathered Senate. He stood beside a display showing thousands of new learning centers being built across the galaxy. For the first time in our history, we will teach our children together, using methods that combine play with learning. Professor Lin, recently appointed as head of the new Galactic Education Council, smiled as she watched a group of alien children playing with replicas of the cube. Each one was specially designed to teach different subjects: mathematics, science, language, and even space navigation. The humans were right all along, she said to Ambassador Jack, who was watching Tom teach some alien children a game called Duck, Duck, Goose in another corner. We had become so focused on advancing our knowledge that we forgot how to learn with joy. The Science Council had undergone the biggest change. Their laboratories now included playrooms where scientists were encouraged to experiment without pressure. Some of their greatest breakthroughs in the past month had come from simply allowing themselves to play with ideas. Today, we welcome our newest members to the Senate Advisory Board, High Speaker Reed continued. A group of children from different species, including humans, stepped forward. These young advisors will help us remember to see things through fresh eyes. Tom, now something of a celebrity across the galaxy, had returned to his normal life on Earth. But his legacy lived on in the changes he had inspired. The Senate had established the Tom Protocol. Any problem that stumped the galaxy's greatest minds for too long would be presented to children for their perspective. The ancient civilization knew something we had forgotten, Ambassador Jack said, addressing the Senate. They knew that the best way to preserve knowledge wasn't to lock it away in vaults or hide it in complex puzzles. It was to make learning so fun that every generation would want to discover it again. Across the galaxy, museums were changing their "do not touch" signs to "please play" with the exhibits. Archaeological sites now included areas where visitors could interact with replicas of ancient artifacts. Learning had become an adventure again. The Eternal Cube, now solved but no less magical, had been moved to a special display where children could watch the hologram messages and try their hands at similar puzzles. Its song had become a popular melody, sung in schools across thousands of worlds. But the greatest change, Professor Lin noted in her official report, isn't in our teaching methods or our technology. It's in how we see ourselves. We remembered that before we were scientists, leaders, or diplomats, we were all children once, filled with curiosity and joy. As the Senate session ended, High Speaker Reed made one final announcement. In honor of Earth's contribution to galactic wisdom, we have decided to establish the Galactic Youth Day as a permanent holiday. And yes, he added with what was definitely a smile this time, there will be ice cream. The chamber filled with laughter and applause. On the main screen, images from across the galaxy showed the changes already taking place, ancient puzzles being solved, new discoveries being made, and most importantly, children and adults learning together, playing together, growing together. And in a small classroom on Earth, Tom sat at his desk, working on his math homework. But now it wasn't just homework. It was a puzzle waiting to be solved, a game waiting to be played, a mystery waiting to be understood, just like the ancient civilization had intended all along. After all, in the end, the greatest mysteries of the universe weren't meant to be solved with serious faces and complex theories. Sometimes they were meant to be solved with a child's smile and the simple joy of play.